Picture a single morning, somewhere near the shore of a quiet, freshwater lake, roughly 7,500 years ago. A farmer wakes up, walks out to check on the fields his family has worked for generations, and notices the water is a little closer to the house than it was yesterday. He doesn't think much of it. The next morning, it's closer again. By the end of the week, it's climbing faster than anyone can explain. And by the end of the month, the fields are gone, the house is gone, and everyone he knows is walking away from the only home they've ever had, carrying whatever they could grab in time. That's not an imagined scene. That's the leading scientific theory for what actually happened at the edge of the ancient Black Sea, back when it was a smaller, lower freshwater lake surrounded by farmland. Rising Mediterranean water broke through a natural barrier near what's now the Bosphorus Strait, and the sea poured in, by some estimates, at a rate 40 times the flow of Niagara Falls for months on end. For the people living there, it must have looked exactly like the end of the world, because for their world, it was. It's worth saying plainly that not every geologist agrees on exactly how sudden this was. Some researchers argue the Black Sea refilled more gradually, over a longer stretch of decades, rather than a single catastrophic season, and that the most dramatic version of the story oversells the speed of it. The broader picture holds up regardless of which estimate turns out to be closest to the truth. Even the slower version still describes a shoreline retreating fast enough within one family's working lifetime to feel less like erosion and more like an ending. Here's where the story gets bigger than one lake. Those displaced farmers didn't vanish. They moved into the Danube Valley, into Anatolia, into Mesopotamia, carrying the memory of watching their entire world disappear underwater. Generations later, in that same region, the Sumerians wrote the story down on clay tablets. A great flood, a warning from the gods, a boat built to survive it, animals loaded aboard 2 by 2, birds sent out to search for dry land. The Babylonians retold it, the Akkadians retold it, and eventually, that same structure was woven into the religious texts that became the story of Noah. The details line up in ways that are hard to write off as coincidence. In the older Mesopotamian version, a man named Utnapishtim is warned in advance by a god, builds a massive vessel, seals it with pitch, loads it with his family and animals of every kind, and rides out the storm before releasing birds one after another to check for dry ground. First a dove that circles back, then a swallow that also returns, and finally a raven that never comes back, signaling the water has receded enough to survive on. Anyone familiar with Noah releasing a dove and a raven from the ark will recognize that sequence almost beat for beat, separated by well over 1,000 years and 2 entirely different religious traditions. And it didn't stop there either. Ancient Greece told its own version through a man named Deucalion. Hindu tradition told it through Manu. Hawaiian tradition told it through Nu. Chinese mythology tells a version centered on taming a flood rather than escaping it. Cultures that never met, never traded, and in some cases, never even knew the other existed, all landed on strikingly similar versions of the same basic memory. A flood, a handful of survivors, and a world that had to start over. Now, here's what actually happened next, in the world we live in. That flood, real or mythologized, depending on which version you're told, became one of the most repeated stories in human history, and it shaped far more than religion. The forced, sudden migration out of that flooded region is one of the leading explanations for why population pressure spiked in the Fertile Crescent exactly when it did. More people, arriving faster than the land could easily absorb them, pushed early communities toward denser settlements, shared irrigation systems, and the earliest city-states. That pressure is part of what historians credit for accelerating the very first writing systems, developed in Sumer to track grain, land, and labor, in exactly the kind of crowded, high-stakes farming communities that sudden displacement tends to produce. Writing led to law. Law led to administration. Administration is what let early empires coordinate armies, taxes, and trade routes across long distances in the first place.
And the story itself did something just as lasting. A flood narrative isn't only an adventure about a boat, it's a story about divine judgment, about a single righteous survivor chosen to continue, and about a promise made afterward that the disaster won't happen again. That exact structure, judgment, survival, covenant, became a foundational shape for religious thought across multiple major traditions that followed. In the world we actually got, the flood is baked into scripture, into the calendar of holidays built around it, into centuries of religious art, and into the basic moral architecture millions of people still build their lives around today. Think about how far that ripples outward. Rainbows carry meaning in more than one tradition, partly because of the covenant promised after the waters receded. Entire genres of religious art, from Renaissance paintings to children's picture books, return again and again to an ark loaded with paired animals. Sermons preached today, thousands of years later, still lean on that same flood as proof of both divine judgment and divine mercy in the same breath. All of it, in this telling, traces back to farmers on the shore of one lake, watching water rise faster than they could explain. So that's what happened. Now, otherwise. Picture that same farmer, that same morning, at the edge of that same lake. Except this time, the natural barrier at the Bosphorus simply holds. The water rises, but slowly, the way lakes normally do, over centuries instead of months. No sudden wall of water, no mass exodus of terrified farmers. No single shared catastrophe burned into an entire region's memory all at once. Without that shock, the population pressure that helped birth the earliest cities never spikes the same way. Migration into Mesopotamia happens on a slower, gentler timeline. People trickling in over many generations, instead of arriving all at once with nothing but what they could carry. Some historians argue dense, competitive city-states are partly a product of exactly this kind of forced urgency. Too many people arriving too quickly forces shared walls, shared irrigation canals, and shared authority just to keep everyone fed and safe. Remove the urgency, and the first true cities may form later, smaller, and scattered across more locations, instead of concentrated in the river valleys that became Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon in our timeline. Villages stay villages longer. Trade networks stay local longer. The entire clock of civilization that history books measure from starts ticking on a noticeably different schedule. Push that forward, and writing itself slows down with it. Cuneiform emerged to manage exactly the kind of overcrowded, resource-strained farming communities a sudden refugee crisis produces. Without that pressure, the need to track grain, land, and debt on clay tablets might not arrive for centuries longer, which means law codes arrive later, which means the administrative systems that let ancient empires coordinate large armies and long trade routes take shape on a completely different schedule. Entire dynasties we consider ancient might not exist yet by the dates we associate with them. Some might never form the same way at all. Follow that thread even further, and it starts touching things that feel much closer to home. The earliest known legal code, inscribed centuries later under Hammurabi, exists partly because a complex, crowded society needed a shared, written system of justice to function at scale. Push the timeline for cities and writing back far enough, and you push back the entire lineage of written law that later legal traditions across the ancient world borrowed from and built on. Mathematics used for surveying land and calculating taxes. Astronomy used for tracking planting seasons. Even the calendar systems some cultures still use today. All of it sits downstream of exactly the kind of dense, pressured early civilization that a sudden catastrophic flood may have helped force into existence ahead of schedule. And the myth, the one that shaped so much of the next several thousand years of religious thought, never gets written because there's no shared catastrophe urgent enough to demand an explanation. Without a flood story anchoring the idea of divine judgment, followed by covenant and rebirth, the earliest religious frameworks might have organized themselves around an entirely different central image. Maybe fire, maybe famine, maybe the sky itself. The basic emotional shape of judgment, survival, and a second chance is common across almost all religious traditions in our actual history. But there's no guarantee that shape survives at all in a version of history where the specific trauma that seems to have inspired it never happened in the first place.
It's strange to consider how much weight a single natural barrier holding or breaking might carry. Rainbows might just be rainbows, with no covenant attached. Sermons preached today might lean on a completely different central image of mercy and judgment, one built around drought instead of drowning, or fire instead of flooding. Entire holiday calendars, built centuries later around a flood that never happened, simply wouldn't exist to build around in the first place. Not because the underlying human need for a story about judgment and forgiveness would disappear. People have always needed that kind of story. But because the specific shape it took, water and an ark and a promise, was never guaranteed. It only happened because, in our timeline, one lake broke its banks in a very particular way. Here's the part worth sitting with the longest, though. Even in the version of history where the Bosphorus barrier holds and that one lake never violently floods, the rest of the planet doesn't get off easy. The last ice age was still ending. Global sea levels were still rising by roughly 400 feet as the ice sheets melted, sometimes gradually, sometimes in genuinely sudden pulses. One event, called Meltwater Pulse 1A, appears to have raised sea levels by nearly 50 feet in just a few centuries. Marine archaeologists have already found the proof sitting on the seafloor. A 9,000-year-old village off the coast of modern Israel, complete with stone water wells resting underwater. An entire lost landscape called Doggerland, once connecting Britain to mainland Europe, swallowed by rising seas within a handful of generations. Which means the flood story might not have needed the Black Sea at all. Somewhere on this planet, in this version of otherwise just as much as in the version we actually got, some coastal community was almost certainly still watching their home disappear beneath the water, 1 week at a time, wondering if this was the end of everything they knew. Different coastline, different century, same basic memory, formed independently by people with no way of knowing anyone else on Earth, had lived through something almost identical. Walk that scene out fully in the otherwise version of this story. A fishing family on the edge of what's now the North Sea packs up a canoe and whatever dried food they can carry, watching the forest they grew up hunting in slowly turn to marsh, then to open water, over the span of a single childhood. A farming family near the coast of what's now Israel watches the well their grandfather dug fill with salt water, forcing them inland to start again from nothing. Neither family ever meets the other. Neither one ever learns. Their story will end up sounding almost identical to a stranger's, thousands of miles away, translated into a completely different language, worshipping a completely different God. So maybe that's the real answer underneath all of this. It isn't that one flood happened and its story spread to every corner of the world. It's that the same kind of flood happened to nearly everyone living near a coastline as the Ice Age came to an end. At different times, in different places, and every single community that lived through it was equally certain theirs was the only flood there ever was. There's an uncomfortable echo of that happening again right now. Coastal communities today are watching a slower version of the same process, driven by a warming climate instead of a retreating ice age. Entire nations are already drafting relocation plans for land their own children may lose. If flood mythology really did emerge from ordinary families watching their world slowly vanish beneath rising water, it's worth wondering what stories today's displaced communities will be telling their own descendants a few thousand years from now, and whether those stories will sound just as familiar to some future audience as Noah and Gilgamesh sound to us. Maybe it won't be a flood at all next time. Maybe it'll be heat or fire, or a sea that simply never stops climbing. But the underlying shape of the story, a world that changed too fast for anyone to fully explain, and the people who survived it anyway, has a way of repeating itself, with or without anyone realizing they're living through the next chapter of the same old story. Picture that shoreline one final time. Not one family in one place in one century, but dozens of families on dozens of coastlines, centuries apart, each one certain they were watching the only flood that ever mattered. Every one of them was right, in their own way. None of them ever knew how many other coastlines were living through the exact same ending, again and again, long before anyone wrote any of it down.
If a shared planetary catastrophe like that could get quietly written into nearly every religion on Earth without anyone realizing they were all describing the same underlying event, it raises an even stranger question. What other unique myths that different cultures believe belong only to them might actually be humanity remembering the same real event from different corners of the world without ever knowing it was shared? That's exactly where we're headed next time on Otherwise, into the myths that might not be myths at all. Subscribe and find out how much further the water actually goes.